Welcome to our webinar today. You'll be glad to know it's all the way up to 13 degrees here in Atlanta, so there's warmth on the way. This is Firestorm. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series, and this particular session is co-sponsored and underwritten by the Georgia Independent School Association. We invite you to become our friend, Firestorm Solutions, on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag for the session, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Keep in mind that this presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. The work product must be read in conjunction with guidance given by your organization's personal counsel. In addition, this information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. Today we're discussing building an intelligent network at your school. The Georgia Independent School Association is our underwriter and co-sponsor of this series, and we're pleased to have them as that we are able to join with them to be able to present these things to you.
And Jeff couldn't be with us today. He is out on association business today as we go forward, but this is a three-part webinar series this quarter on building an intelligence network, and we're going to focus today in particular on behaviors of concern and how that's incorporated together. We're also going to plant the seed on what's involved in creating this intelligence network and how that fits into your plans within your schools. Firestorm's very pleased with the relationship with the Georgia Independent School Association, and as you are having to address issues within your schools across the state. So my name's Jim Satterfield. I'm going to be the presenter today, and Bill will probably chime in a couple of points along the way. By the way, Bill is our Vice President for Operations at Firestorm, and Bill, 13 degrees or 14 degrees still doesn't sound very warm to me as we think about it. Hopefully change will be coming in that temperature as we're looking at, and I think the threats and the risk that we see is the rate of change that is occurring. Many of our thoughts today are geared by recent events that we've been hearing about and seeing and watched play out. The shootings in Paris yesterday, the attack that took place there, I think signifies some of the concerns that we all see from either the lone gunman or the small team that could intervene and have an impact. Particularly horrific, and I don't know if you observed a lot of the detail around it. They gained access into the space by typing in a code on the door on a keypad that they forced a lady and who was with her daughter to give to them. And so the exposure factors here are very real, and those impacts can be quite significant. And as we look at these types of groups, the threats that were made after 9/11 by Al-Qaeda, the ISIS threats that are there, the targeting of schools is one of the areas that have been a continual vulnerability. Imagine the impact that if there were teams sent to schools across the country, the terror level that would create in each of our school areas. So that's why it's important to have an intelligence network, to know what's been said, what's going on, and what's occurring within your other area. Just also an additional mention, we're in flu season at this point. And if I told you that 28 children had died as a result of Ebola in the United States, there would be an alarm that would go off. But 28 children in America have already died as a result of the flu season this year. The flu that we see year in and year out poses a very real threat, and it's a significant one for us to focus on and think about communicable illness. The majority of the states in the country are at high levels of outbreaks within their states. We're seeing schools being disrupted as a result of absenteeism in the local area, and so I would encourage you to continue your monitoring of attendance and the triggers to understand what you need to do within your school. We also have measles outbreaks now in 8 states across the country. I think the most sensational one is the one that came out of Disneyland. So even childhood diseases are a factor as we think about what's going on and the rate of change that we're handling. So as we think about this, can you identify what your school's next crisis is? And that's going to be the theme that we want to talk about today as we go through and talk about creating an intelligence network and particularly focusing on behaviors of concern. We can spend a lot of money on video cameras and fences and security, but if we're ignoring what the information that's out there, that's going to make a significant difference within your organization. And so you need to have this ability built into the plans that you have. Now, the firestorm process is predict, plan, perform. We've talked about that a great deal in these webinar series that we've been doing, and I want to underscore we're going to really be focusing today on the predict square. As we focus there, we're looking at predicting what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what are their impacts, identifying what it is you should monitor, and what are the triggers that would activate your plans. That's an important building block, and in this entire quarter, we're going to be focused on in this Georgia Independent School Association webinar series around this intelligence network and creating this and getting it to an actionable level as we go through each of those areas. Now, as we think about that, who's responsible? Who's responsible for this risk factor? And in our schools, it's very clear. It's the board of your school, along with your leadership. Your head of school is responsible for preparing for the risks that are out there. Across organizations and schools around the country, we find in many cases that they don't identify the risks before they occur. We spend a lot of time in our schools doing fire drills. Hey, when the fire occurs, this is what we do. We spend time looking at the standard response protocol, shelter in place, lockdown, lockout, evacuation. Those are all actions to take once the event occurs. The emphasis needs to shift earlier into the process to identifying those risks before they occur so that you can have an intervention that will result. If we don't eliminate those, then there's a disproportional event that will occur. It'll impact our students and our teachers and our parents and our families. It'll impact the brand and reputations of our schools. It becomes an area that we're quite concerned about as this would come together. And so our conversation today is going to be geared on this area in particular. But I think the question that comes up is, can you really predict a crisis? And the answer is yes, unequivocally that you can, but you have to know what the warning signs are. And if you don't, and those go unheeded, then the crisis is more likely to occur. So in focusing on this, knowing what the warning signs are, and in particular, what are the indicators of a crisis? And we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about indicators and to make sure that people are trained and have processes in place to address those before they reach a crisis level. Our research shows that this is a pattern. These patterns are predictable, and they shape both the severity, how bad is it going to be, and the frequency, how often it would occur. In many cases, we find schools and organizations feel like it's not going to happen here. That's really going somewhere else. But the value is in focusing on these indicators to identify the pre-crisis before it occurs so that you can mitigate those areas. Now, as we think about indicators, they are cues. I had to slow down to say those. That's somewhat of a tongue twister to me today, that give us information about emerging events. They're things that have some level that we need to start to take a look at. Do we move to the left or do we move to the right? What are those indicators? They can be behavioral. It can be some action that a student or an employee is doing. It could be some transaction or process change, an email, a posting, something on Facebook, or some change that has been seen. It can be transmitted orally, or it could be in nonverbal means. Social media today is one of the primary tools in creating an intelligence network to find out what's going on within your school community, what's being said, what actions need to be taken place. Those elements are there. Now, if we don't understand these indicators, if everyone is in fact not made aware, then we're going to miss them and miss those opportunities. And so this is a part of the culture so that our students, our teachers, our staff, our faculty, everyone is aware of what those warning signs are. And so we want to focus today in our conversation around this behavior of concern. I don't want to ignore the clearly obvious threats and statements of intent to cause harm. When you see those, then that gives us no choice. You must begin to do an intervention. But the behaviors of concern are the early indicators before it has escalated to that threat or the physical action that would take place. So it's important that everybody understands what these behavioral environmental issues are. An environmental issue could be problems that are occurring in a home, domestic violence and how it comes forward into the school marketplace. It could be a suicide concern for a particular individual. And we're seeing the suicide students moving to having kill lists to settle agreements before it occurred. The shootings that occurred in Seattle late last year are a perfect example where the student orchestrated sending messages so that the people that he wanted to attack were all at one table within the cafeteria to carry that action forth. So what we want to do is to find that someone who might be on a path to violence, someone who's exhibiting these behaviors of concern, and then we want to intervene before it escalates, before it gets to that level. And that's the challenge that faces our educators today as they're dealing in the school environment. So how do you know what you don't know? And the first answer is we've got to go out and create an intelligence network. There has to be a network within your school that's going to give you what you need to know. And we'll go through what the components of that are in a few minutes. But our goals here are to know today what will happen tomorrow. If you knew there was going to be a problem in your school tomorrow and you knew it today, you could intervene. You could mitigate it. You could prevent it from occurring. Those are the things that we want to go, and that's clearly the goal of having an intelligence network. The way you do that is through the predict, plan, perform that we've talked about, and having ways to track. We want to know what's going to happen, where is it going to happen, when is it going to happen, and what's the pattern of life that's going on around that. Is this a substance issue? Is there other factors that are coming into play associated with it? And then what are the metrics there? And we're trying to take the uncertainty that each of you face every day and move that into certainty. The process then is going to be using the ability to listen and look. And we're going to talk about listening and looking in a few minutes as we go into more detail around that. But I would like to start to have you think about listening to what's being said and looking then at particular persons of interest, particularly what's being posted out on the internet, so that we can pull those aspects together. So here, if we go a little further into listening and looking, it's the ability of creating a conversation, I left out an A there, aggregators that are how we understand what's going on, identifying what's being communicated regarding our school and our people. We utilize streams. Streams are a series of phrases. Phrases are made up of words. And then as we're looking there, and it creates a situational awareness within your school to understand of what's going on. Once we find that, then we want to look in more detail, and that's becoming much more focused. We use different tools, one to do the general listening, and another then to go looking at a particular individual. And it could be based upon an identified crisis, risk, behavior, exposure, or vulnerability. We can do geocoding. We can look at what comments are being said and posted on the school grounds, or if we're going back and tracking back to an individual's home and looking at the postings that are there. We can look at the sphere of influence that they have. Who else are they communicating? Who else is involved with this? And we have the ability with a time machine to go back into time and find out what were they saying last week or last month, and is there a pattern that's starting to come. It's a much more targeted tool as we go into this area. So you get situational awareness is the listening. The looking becomes a very targeted awareness now around a particular incident, event, or person as it coming together. If you do not have those types of tools within your school, there is information that's out about threats and issues that are going on, and you need to be able to find out. In working with a large organization, we picked one of their distribution centers. It was obviously not a school, and we put a geofence around it just to find out what was being said at work in that particular area. We found one employee who had 50 posts within a normal business day. That's a lot to have if you're trying to do your job and keep up with what's going on. And as we further delved into it, we could see that there was racial tension. There was a struggle between the supervisor and the employee was frustrated to the point who, in his making postings, the only way to resolve this is to bring a gun to work, and the escalations were to continue. Well, think of the value to that client to know that there was an employee who felt that they had reached a point where the only thing they could do was to bring a gun to work. Think about the student who thinks that the only thing that they can do is commit suicide. The only thing they can do is to strike back at the bully who'd been attacking them, or the sexual molestation, or the abuse, or the domestic violence elements that are coming together. All of that information about your students is in the public domain on the internet. Having the tools to look will become key elements in creating your intelligence network, and we'll share more about that. But when we think about intelligence, I want to add another modifier here, and that's predictive. What we're trying to do is not just get information, we're trying to find out what we feel is going to be happening. And communications is the most perishable form of intelligence. Knowing what was said a year ago is not the same as knowing what's being said right now, and the value of what's being said right now deteriorates rapidly over time. And we divide this predictive intelligence into hard and soft data. Soft data are visual cues that you can see about human behavior. Even your intuition or your experience in dealing with a particular student will give you some soft analysis of this as they come forward. Hard data includes emails, social media postings, admonitions of intent. If it's very specific, it's very detailed, and there is no doubt associated with what's occurring within the school. As you look at this predictive intelligence between hard and soft data, technology certainly can aid in looking at the hard data. So it's not a matter of you running a Google search, it's a matter of having the proper tools in place to bring to your attention those things that are a particular concern within your school. One central repository, it becomes very critical then for this information, because you may take a fact from here and add it with a fact that's occurred over there, and the combination of the two become a cue to you that action needs to take place. Also, the progression over time. So we see in many cases information is siloed. Someone sees something and then they hold that information, they don't share it. Someone else sees something else, they hold that information and not share it, and then there's the escalation. That's where our concerns are as it comes together. So if we're thinking about creating an intelligence network, there are 4 components that come immediately to mind. And you're doing a lot of this today. Some of this you're not doing. One are background checks. And we've talked about that in previous webinars, and we'll continue to talk about what the standards and best practices are associated with it. But if we can stop the problem before it comes to our school, that's a great step for us to take. Anonymous reporting has generally failed because the see something, say something, we find that people see and they don't say. And so you need to develop a program that is supported by your culture that will support those individuals to bring information that should come to your attention. In another webinar, we'll talk about how to make anonymous reporting work, and much more specifically. Today, we're going to focus on behavioral risk threat assessment. What do you do once you identify this behavior of concern and to carry it forward? And that's the area that becomes the trickiest for you within your organization, and we're going to spend some time today to frame that. And the last is social media monitoring. There are tools that will come out and help you listen and then look and then be able to target that information in coming forward. We'll take a whole session and do just on the approach on the monitoring that's needed to be involved. But look at this definition of crisis. A risk event for which no one has identified the vulnerabilities and exposures, has not developed a plan, and does not know how to respond. Having an intelligence network identifies those individuals before there's a problem within your school, before violence occurs, before there's an injury or, in a horrific case, a death. That's what we want to focus on today, is how do we do that once we've seen this area, once we recognize that there's a behavior of concern, how do we carry forward with that? So as we think about behavioral risk threat assessment, what we want to do is to focus now on what do you do and when do you do it. Now, behaviors of concern, let's do a continuum here, and we're going to divide this up for a few minutes. Our goal is to intervene right where it shows behavior of concern on the chart on the right, when it's low on the thermometer or the barometer, before it escalates up to threatening behavior, before it escalates to physical injury, or even ultimately death. But there's a continuum of things that are already occurring in your school, and you're doing a good job in addressing those. Those things that are very low, it's just normal discipline. You have that process down. You do clearly an excellent job. That's not what we're talking about today. We want you to continue to deal with those low risk, those low levels of concern, those low levels of behaviors of concern. Deal with it as you traditionally have done that, and done so very successfully. The high level is very clear also. That's the other end of the extreme. You see an individual with a gun, we're calling 911. That's not a point of discussion. If there's violence and physical attacks that have occurred, that's for the police and the intervention at those levels. So we're going to remove that, and now let's talk about this median area, the gray area. What is it that we're going to do in this area of behaviors of concern? And we're going to delve into that into much greater detail. We divide those behaviors of concern into three sub-buckets: guarded, elevated, and severe, and we'll explain those as we go forward. That's the nature of our conversation today. What do we do with these behaviors that are not minor, not the low, and not major, calling the police? How do we identify them? And once we've done that, what is it that we need to do within our school? That's our concern and where we're going to be focused today. So behavioral risk threat assessment is the term associated with that. You need a program so that you can assist in identifying, assessing how bad is it, managing it, and monitoring. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Before there's a threat of violence to themselves or others. We're seeing this pattern repeated daily across the country. This isn't only a business workplace problem. It's not just a public school problem. This is a private school problem, an independent school problem. It's a problem in every organization because the individuals are out there who pose this threat to themselves or others. So having a program that you can manage it, having procedures, having framework in which you can process that with defined goals, and particularly here the goal that I would encourage you to do is the identification and the intervention before there's an escalation. That's what I want you to think about today as we talk about it. So the behavioral risk
Jim, could I
risk threat assessment.
Throw in the thought?
Sure.
Sure. Before this webinar, we were discussing briefly about being able to identify things and what to do. And we pointed out that there's a difference between companies and schools. Companies, if they have an individual that's showing bad behavior, they simply fire them, get them out of the building. Schools don't really always have that option. you've got students, you've got to stay with them. Even if you do get rid of someone, you know, I think of the event down in Jacksonville with the Episcopal school where they fired the employee. He came back in the afternoon and murdered the headmistress. It's, you know, these problems outlive and outlast the relationship between employment or attendiness or whatever. You've got them before and after.
And I think that's an important one to bring up, Bill, and I think you're exactly correct. So creating this awareness, there are 4 elements in creating such a program: awareness, reporting, the central repository so the information is not lost, and then having a plan. Now that we've identified what is it that we're going to do with it. Awareness is everyone within your organization. They need to be able to understand that this is an area that someone needs to know, and there has to be a reporting capability for students, for teachers, for all of the people in your organization. And then keeping this information in a single point so that it's not lost. And then having a plan so that you can deal with the investigation, the screening, the action plan, the monitoring, the sign-off, and the record keeping. We're going to go through those elements in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes. So there has to be a formal investigation procedure. How do you go through? How do you document it? What are the forms so that we make sure that we don't miss or overreact? We don't miss something that's a particular concern, or that we take actions that we don't need to. You've then got to identify and train who's going to be responsible to do that, how are they qualified in those directions. In some cases, you may need to involve legal counsel because of the potential activities that are here, and in many cases that provides you some levels of privilege associated. Then you need to have a specifically identified behavioral assessment team within your school, someone that's from the counseling department, or if you have a separate HR area or security, or maybe someone from the leadership team within your school. At least 3 people need to be on the team. I would not let your team be bigger than 4 or at most 5. You want to keep this very small, very close. 3 is quite adequate in being able to do it. And then you have to determine what are the screening tools that we're going to utilize. Are you going to follow the Secret Service, the FBI protocols? Are you going to do Waiver 21, Mosaic, K-Wood, or some of the others that are out there? They all have strengths. They all have weaknesses. Using the same tool in the same way every time gives you the consistency and the certainty in how it comes together. How do you notify the team? How do they convene? Because once the behavior has been identified, actions need to take place very quickly. Then there has to be a corrective action program that's put into place dealing with that particular threat that comes together. So here's a little bit more description of each of the elements: the investigation, the screening, which we're going to go through in a little bit more detail, and then dividing it into that guarded, elevated, and severe in just a moment. Then the action plan: what are we going to do with this individual once we now understand what's going on? And then how do we monitor that behavior? And then the sign-off and record keeping as that process goes forward. Is this behavior de-escalating or is it escalating? Those become elements of concern for us as we go forward. So we've got to carry forward, and as we said on the earlier slide, with an awareness program, having the reporting capabilities, the central repository, and then the plan. And then the plan is each of these 5 areas as it comes into place. To know that every time we're going to do, this is the investigation. We're talking to the teacher. We're talking to all the teachers that interact with the student. We're talking with the student. We're talking with the family. We're doing these things internally. These things we're going to have a recommendation and referral externally to a psychologist or a psychiatrist in going through. Documenting this becomes absolutely critical for not only the protection of the individual students that are involved, but the school, because what did you know and when did you know it becomes an issue that's generated. So the way that we have found that provides clarity in that middle ground, remember the low, we're just going to handle it with our normal discipline areas, and the high, we're calling 911 and the police. Those are easy. So let's pull that out and talk about this gray area in the middle, this area where it's a medium risk. It's unclear exactly how bad is it. We'd find that dividing that into 3 distinct groups with a rating system of guarded is the lowest, elevated is the next, and severe is the highest level. Now this gives you some idea of what you would do. If it's at that low level, it's in the median area, it's above the normal, but we need to do something. We need to do some supervision. We have to have some intervention regarding the incident, the behavior that has occurred, and there has to be a specific follow-back up. We just can't ignore it or say, we looked at it, it wasn't so bad, and let's close the door, because this may be your first indication that a student is at risk, that an employee is at risk. And do not underestimate the impact that we're seeing with domestic risk coming into the school and affecting the organization. Just above that is the elevated. That's where we're going to do some enhanced supervision. We're going to be much closer to the person who had the problem. And there's going to be a much more formal intervention regarding what created this with a specific follow-up. Those are going to be that middle ground in the area. It could move to the left and de-escalate, or it can move to the right and escalate up to severe. That changes the world. This area of severe, because the next step is obviously the violence that would occur. Obviously the suicide or the bringing of this gun to school comes into place. So the first thing that we would do is remove the person that fell in the severe category. If it's a teacher, we would ask them to leave until we resolve the issue. If it's a student, we'd be sending them home until we're clear that there's no longer a threat or an imminent harm to themselves or others. This could well involve having them meet with a psychiatrist or a psychologist or even a forensic psychologist. Forensic psychologists will render an opinion that the person is a risk to themselves or others or is no longer at that point. There has to be a written action and monitoring plan here. Maybe we did the first up at the guarded level. It's much more informal. But if it's in this level and that behavior assessment team, those 3 individuals have said, you know, the next thing is going to be very bad. It's at this severe level, and when you've done your analysis, if you come to that conclusion, then the follow-up and controls have to be much more specific as we go through each of those things. So what are some of the triggers? What are the recognition points that would start to guide us in helping to look at this? And this is just the beginning of having the discussion, and it would need to be in much more detail for your behavior assessment team to be able to render it. Clearly, any threat, a threat, whether it's veiled, I might do this, or conditional, hey, if this doesn't happen, I'm going to take this action. But the most concern here is the direct threat. I'm going to do this to this individual on this date, and they have the motivation and the means to accomplish that. You have to have an intervention at that point in time. The emergence of that threat automatically triggers us, at least at the severe level that we were discussing within the rating of the medium areas. If the gun's already at school, we're beyond that. We're at that highest level in the direct intervention that's coming into place. But our goal is to catch this behavior and catch it before it escalates to that level. Verbal behavior, what are they saying, the words they're using, the actions they're taking. Written behavior, that's where the intelligence network, we're finding that across the board, both our young people and our teachers are saying things and posting it on Facebook and on Twitter. That information is out there, the Instagram. Those things are available. It's in the public domain. There are comments that are being said about your school, and you need to know about that. We have cited in many of our webinars the identification of the gun threat coming to school or the attack that would occur. That's happening to us multiple times every day. At a minimum, it's 60 times a day that we see these threats have occurred within schools spread across the country. that actions need to be taken as a result of the threats that are there. It's posted, it's out, it's direct, it's done, and with the ability of the look and the listen that we talked about in the time machine, even if the threat is removed, we can go back to the time when it was on the internet and see it there and capture that information. So it's not enough that they change or bring it down. We can bring you back to the point so that you have the full information to make an informed decision. Clearly, if it becomes physical, if there's a blow, if there's a strike, if something that's occurred, that would trigger an indication. If it's sexual molestation and abuse is clearly a factor that we're concerned about in schools and in businesses. It's an area that needs to be a primary trigger associated with it. Domestic violence that's occurring, we're seeing domestic violence moving from the home into the school. And that affects not only our students, but our teachers. We regularly find where a spouse knows that the person will be at work at this time, at this location, and that becomes the center of those aspects with it. And the murder-suicide aspects, we did a discussion earlier today where a teacher had taken a vacation and fell victim to a murder-suicide as a result of that because of the time that was known and coming together. And then suicide. The suicide scale of identifying the threats and understanding that the person is a risk to themselves and others, and almost invariably we find that there are kill lists that the person wants to get even with others. The attack that occurred out in Washington earlier this year, or late last year, he had invited the people that he was targeting to lunch in the cafeteria so that everyone he wanted to hit was in one place at one time associated with it. So this is an area for you to be focused on. We can go into much more detail around those areas, but those are the abilities to start to recognize what's happening. Now, when we talked about a plan, this is what are we going to do now that we've identified this risk level as concern. We have to have an action plan of how we're going to intervene with that particular student, and it's going to remain in place until they're no longer a danger to themselves or others. You've got to share that plan with the teachers, with those in your organization who are aware, and they've got an interest in this person, because some other cue that they pick up can give you an indication that the plan is working, or, unfortunately, if the plan is not working. So as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts here today. Across the board, we're finding that most schools don't have an intelligence network in place where they're doing the proper social media risk monitoring. That's a key gap, or don't have a trained behavioral assessment team in place and a formalized program to doing it. I would encourage you to start today writing down what your process is so that you can make sure that your people are in fact trained. Having that your plans actionable becomes a key element. Here's just a page out of one of the Firestorm behavioral risk threat assessment programs, and it starts from the time of the report when it comes in. You'll notice immediately if it's a life safety issue that there's different directions that are given, and then depending upon the sense of urgency, what actions are going to take place. And we find that when things are clearly assigned, as you see in this example, and the ability to check off a box, did we do this here, does this apply? It's a way to make sure that you aren't missing something associated with it. You'll also then, you want to have forms that you've established in the continuity of doing the same thing every time there's a behavior of concern. Provides protection not only to the person who has the problem or they might impact, but the school. Because after an event that occurs, you're going to be asked, what did you know, when did you know it, and what did you do? That becomes a key element associated with each of these areas. And so create those documents, have them in place, have people trained on how to monitor and put that process in place. Down at that step 105, how you interview witnesses, what are the materials that you're collecting, how are you pulling it together, how is it coming together, so that the behavioral assessment team then can evaluate, is this at a guarded level, Is it at an elevated level, or is it all the way to severe where we need to remove them from school? So we've covered a lot of ground today in terms of creating an intelligence network, and in February and March we're going to continue this and go a little bit deeper into each of the elements associated with it. But I wanted to frame today a little bit for you to think about your school and what you have in place and what you're doing. So the next steps. Ask yourself and those around you, do you really want to know what will happen tomorrow? If you decide, no, we're going to deal with it when it happens, that's going to be who we are, we're going to be in a reactive mode, my quick question would be is, can you afford not to know? And we're in a world today where things happen so quickly. The access to guns is very easy. That information could easily be an action that could happen. And that information is out there for you to know today. Someone within your school knows what's going on. Someone in your school has that information, and they're sharing that information on social media today. It's out there. It's in the public domain. And there's an expectation that you're looking and responding. If you would like to learn more, you can contact us to see how your plans align to standards and best practices. You can talk with us about how you create your own intelligence network, or if you need some training to help with your behavioral assessment team or the investigation process or any of the other areas that need to come together. If you'd like to know how your plans align to standards and best practices, Firestorm, because of the relationship with the Georgia Independent School Association, would be glad to do an analysis of your preparedness plans or your behavioral plans or any of the areas that we've talked about and waive the charge associated with that. That's a $2,500 value, and it's a result of your membership in the Georgia Independent School Association. Our thanks to them for arranging this webinar series, and as we continue our discussions and dialogue and going forward, if you would like to view this webinar or share it with others within your school, you can go to firestorm.com/GISA and have a copy of this recording or any of the others in the webinar series that we've done together. You can also go there to register for future webinars in the series as we carry forward. If you've got a specific question about the topics that we've been talking about today, you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. We're going to make every effort to reach out to those of you who are on the call today to see if there are questions and try to come together. We live in times where the risk factors are escalating, and we want to see the intervention occur when it's just a risk and not an actual crisis. No one wants to pick up the phone to call a parent to say, your child's not coming home from school today. Firestorm's experience at Virginia Tech and Littleton and New Mexico and in countless other situations around the country, we can share with you what you need to do. But the key is creating an intelligence network, understanding that there's behaviors of concern that are occurring every day. You can know what's happening within your school. It's expected. You can intervene in a life before there's a tragedy. That's our goal and hope for you. We wish that 2015 will be a great year for your school. We're excited about working together with you and the Georgia Independent School Association. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and let's try to get that weather a little warmer down here in Georgia. Talk to everyone later. Thanks. Goodbye.